Chad just walked out of the room, and the entire power grid in the Sahel went dark for the West. Not metaphorically, literally. For decades, N'Djamena was the quiet anchor, the unseen fortress where French jets refueled, where American drones launched in silence, where surveillance networks mapped jihadist cells from Mali to Nigeria. Chad didn't just host foreign forces, it made their entire war machine possible. And now, it's gone. The door slammed shut, the alliance fractured, and what rose in its place is something no one in Brussels or Washington saw coming. A unified front stretching unbroken across the heart of Africa, armed not just with troops, but with gold, uranium, and the kind of political will that rewrites maps. This isn't just Chad joining the Alliance of Sahel States. This is the completion of a continental power bloc that changes everything. Mali said no to France. Burkina Faso kicked them out with force. Niger cut the cord and reclaimed its uranium. But Chad? Chad was supposed to stay loyal. Chad was the last pillar, the final foothold. And when it fell, it didn't just fall. It ran straight into the arms of its neighbors and said, "We're done being your launch pad. We're building our own future now." What no one expected was how fast the chessboard would flip. Because here's what just materialized. A continuous corridor of sovereignty, from the Atlantic influence zone to the edges of the Sahara, all under one strategic umbrella. The AES isn't a loose pact anymore. It's a geopolitical engine. For nations, one vision, and beneath their feet lies some of the most resource-rich land on the continent. Gold that funds economies, uranium that powers reactors, oil that fuels industry. For years, those resources flowed outward, contracts signed in foreign capitals, profits extracted by foreign firms. But this alliance is flipping the script. Coordinated resource policy, collective trade leverage, financial independence that doesn't bow to conditionalities from Paris or DC. This is what self-determination looks like when it's not performed for cameras. It's strategic, it's calculated, and it's happening in real time. Is this the turning point or the start of something darker? Drop your take, because the shockwaves are already hitting every war room from the Pentagon to the Élysée Palace. Western security infrastructure in the Sahel didn't just lose a partner, it lost its spine. Without Chad, surveillance gaps widen. Logistics chains break. Counter-terror operations that relied on Chadian intelligence, Chadian airspace, Chadian ground support, all of it now has to be reimagined or abandoned. And while Western powers scramble to relocate, to renegotiate, to salvage what's left, the AES is moving in the opposite direction. Inward, building its own security frameworks, training its own forces, rejecting the foreign military model that promised stability but delivered dependency. But this isn't just about kicking out old powers. It's about what gets built in the vacuum. The AES is betting on something radical. That African problems can be solved by African solutions. That sovereignty isn't just a talking point, it's a policy. That pooling resources, intelligence, and military coordination across borders can create a security architecture that doesn't need foreign approval to function. It's ambitious, it's risky, and it's already reshaping how the region sees itself. What comes next is where it gets even more intense. Because unity is one thing, sustaining it is another. These nations have different political systems, different economic realities, different vulnerabilities. But they also share something powerful, a collective memory of exploitation, of being the chessboard instead of the players. And that memory is now fuel. He came for sovereignty, and he brought 3 nations with him. This wasn't just a treaty signing. This was a declaration. The Sahel just became a bloc. And the world is still catching up to what that means. So here's the question. Is this the rise of a new African order, or the beginning of a power struggle the continent isn't ready for? You decide, because history is being written right now, and no one's waiting for permission. They called him the West's last man standing in the Sahel, and then he switched sides. No warning. No negotiation. Just a clean break that shattered every assumption Washington and Paris had been building on for 30 years. Chad, the silent fortress, the intelligence hub, the logistics nerve center for every drone strike and counter-terror op from Mali to the Lake Chad Basin, gone. Not compromised. Not wavering. Gone. And what emerged in its place wasn't collapse. It was consolidation. The Alliance of Sahel States just became something far more dangerous than a coalition. It became a continental force with teeth, resources, and a vision that doesn't need Western approval to survive. This wasn't just a defection. This was a detonation, because Chad didn't just leave the old order. It walked straight into the arms of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, completing a unified front that now stretches across the richest, most strategically vital corridor in Africa. Gold, uranium, oil, rare earth minerals that power everything from smartphones to nuclear reactors. For decades, those resources were carved up by foreign contracts, extracted under terms written in distant capitals, profits funneled out while the region stayed dependent. But now those resources sit under one political umbrella, one coordinated bloc, and for the first time in modern history, the Sahel controls its own wealth, not in theory, but in practice. The shockwave isn't just military, it's psychological, it's generational. You'll see why this matters in a way that transcends troop movements and airspace agreements. Because across the region, millions of young Africans are watching this unfold in real time, and what they're seeing is something they were told was impossible. Sovereignty without chaos. Independence without collapse. A regional power structure that doesn't bow to foreign interests and isn't imploding under the weight of its own contradictions. Chad was supposed to be the proof that you couldn't survive without Western backing. That cutting ties meant instability, coups, and economic freefall. But Chad didn't fall. It rose. And that narrative shift is more destabilizing to the old order than any missile system. Is this the birth of a new Africa? Or the spark that ignites something even the AES can't control? Drop your take, because the ripple effects are already tearing through every embassy from Abuja to Brussels. The infrastructure that just collapsed wasn't just physical, it was ideological. For decades, Western powers operated on a single assumption: that African nations needed them more than they needed each other. That regional unity was a fantasy, that sovereignty was a slogan, that the real power would always flow through Paris, through Washington, through the institutions that held the purse strings and wrote the security doctrines. Chad's realignment didn't just challenge that assumption, it obliterated it. Because what the AES is building now isn't dependent on foreign military bases or intelligence sharing agreements with NATO. It's building its own security architecture, its own economic leverage, its own political identity. And it's doing it in the open, unapologetically, with a confidence that signals this isn't a phase, it's a transformation. And here's where it gets even more intense. This isn't happening in isolation. The psychological ignition Chad just sparked is spreading. Young activists, political movements, civil society leaders across West and Central Africa are watching this and asking a question that terrifies every old power structure on the continent. If Chad can do it, why can't we? The ideological current that just surged through the region isn't about anti-Westernism for its own sake. It's about self-determination. It's about control. It's about looking at decades of dependency and saying, we're done. He came for sovereignty, and he brought the entire Sahel with him. This wasn't just a realignment. This was a declaration that the rules have changed, that the old playbook doesn't work anymore, that a new generation of leaders is writing a different script. And whether that script leads to stability or something far more volatile, no one knows yet. Cameroon just became the most dangerous country in Africa, and it didn't fire a single shot. One day it was a quiet transit hub, pipelines humming, oil flowing from Chad to the Atlantic coast, business as usual. The next day, the ground beneath it shifted, and suddenly Yaoundé is standing at the center of a geopolitical storm it never asked for. Because Chad didn't just join the Alliance of Sahel States, it dragged Cameroon into the spotlight with it. Every barrel of Chadian oil that needs to reach global markets flows through Cameroon's territory, through its ports, under its jurisdiction. And now, with Chad aligned to a sovereignty bloc that just told the West to step back, Cameroon has a choice to make. A choice that could reshape the entire power structure from the Sahara to the Atlantic. A choice that has no safe answer. This is what pressure looks like when it's not theoretical. Cameroon is caught between two forces pulling in opposite directions, and both of them are watching every move. On one side, the AES, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and now Chad. A unified front that controls gold, uranium, oil, and a growing ideological movement that's rewriting what sovereignty means in Africa. On the other side, Western powers who've spent decades building influence, infrastructure, and intelligence networks across the region, and who cannot afford to lose access to Chadian energy exports. Cameroon is the bridge between these two worlds. And bridges, when the ground shakes, don't stay neutral for long. Here's where it gets intense. If Yaoundé tilts toward the AES, even incrementally, the strategic balance across West and Central Africa flips overnight. A continuous corridor of aligned nations stretching from the interior to the coast, with coordinated resource policy, shared security frameworks, and unified political leverage against foreign powers. That's not just a regional shift. That's a continental power bloc with the infrastructure to back it up. Energy exports under regional control. Trade routes that don't depend on Western approval. A vision of self-determination that suddenly has the economic and geographic foundation to survive long-term. You'll see why this terrifies every strategist in Brussels and Washington, because it's not hypothetical anymore. It's one decision away from reality. Is Cameroon about to become the next domino, or the wall that stops the wave? Drop your take, because what happens next could redefine Africa's future for a generation. But here's the other edge of the blade. If Cameroon resists, if it stays aligned with Western interests and refuses to accommodate AES momentum, it doesn't just stay stable, it becomes a target. Not militarily, at least not immediately, but economically, politically, diplomatically. Chad needs those pipelines. The AES needs access to the Atlantic. And if Cameroon becomes the bottleneck, the pressure doesn't just stay external, it turns inward. Instability doesn't announce itself with sirens. It starts with tensions over transit fees, disputes over pipeline security, fractures in border agreements. Then it escalates. And in a region where coups have become the new language of political change, where military juntas have overthrown governments and rewritten alliances in a matter of months, Cameroon's resistance could make it the next flashpoint. The next place where internal fractures meet external pressure and something breaks. What no one expected was how fast Chad's defection would turn Cameroon into the most decisive pivot on the continent. Because this isn't just about oil. It's about geography. It's about control. Cameroon is the gateway, the transit state that connects the Sahel's resource wealth to global markets. And now that Chad is part of a bloc that's actively rejecting foreign dependency, Cameroon's neutrality isn't neutral anymore, it's a position. A position that forces a choice. Align with the new order and risk Western backlash, or hold the line and risk becoming the obstacle that the AES has to go through or around. He came for sovereignty, and now the entire region is waiting to see who follows. This wasn't just a realignment. This was a chain reaction. And Cameroon is the next link. The next pressure point. The chess pieces just moved, and the players at the table aren't who they used to be. Chad's defection to the Alliance of Sahel States didn't just shake the region. It sent tremors through Washington, Paris, Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing. Because what happened in N'Djamena wasn't a local power shuffle. It was a signal. A declaration that the Sahel is no longer a passive theater where global powers carve out influence and call it strategy. The Sahel is reorganizing itself. And for the first time in decades, it's not asking permission. It's not waiting for consensus. It's moving, and the old powers are scrambling to figure out what that means for everything they've built. The United States just lost something it can't easily replace. Military positioning. For years, Chad was the anchor for American counterterror operations, the logistics hub that made surveillance, drone strikes, and intelligence gathering across the Sahel possible. Without it, the entire architecture fractures. Bases that relied on Chadian coordination now operate in the dark. Intelligence networks that depended on access to Chadian airspace and ground intel are suddenly blind. And the strategic reality is brutal. There's no quick replacement. No neighboring country can fill that void without triggering the same pressures that just pulled Chad into the AES orbit. The Pentagon isn't just losing a partner. It's losing the infrastructure that made its entire Sahel strategy functional. France and Europe are staring at something even darker. The slow, irreversible erosion of dominance. Not through military defeat, but through obsolescence. For decades, French influence in the Sahel was built on security guarantees, energy contracts, and the assumption that these nations needed Europe more than Europe needed them. Chad's realignment shattered that assumption. Because now, the energy that flows from Chad to global markets moves through a region that's actively rejecting European frameworks. The security architecture that kept French forces embedded across the Sahel is collapsing piece by piece. And the long-term fear isn't about losing Chad. It's about what comes next. The Cameroon follows. If the entire corridor from the Sahara to the Atlantic becomes a unified bloc that doesn't need European backing to survive, that's not just a loss of influence. That's a loss of relevance. Is this the moment global power shifts south? Or the beginning of a scramble that pulls the Sahel into chaos? Drop your take, because the next moves are already being calculated in rooms you'll never see. But here's where it gets more complex. Russia and China aren't panicking. They're watching, with strategic patience, with the kind of long-term vision that doesn't need immediate results to feel like winning. Because while Western powers see Chad's defection as a loss, Moscow and Beijing see it as an opening. Not through confrontation, not through military bases or regime change operations, but through alignment, through investment, through offering the AES something the West never could: partnership without conditionality. Russia's Wagner remnants and security agreements in Mali and Burkina Faso suddenly look less like isolated deals and more like a blueprint. China's infrastructure investments, its resource partnerships, its willingness to engage without lecturing. These aren't accidents. They're strategic positioning. And Chad's realignment just expanded the board. What no one expected was how quickly the Sahel would stop being a place where global powers competed and start being a place where global power itself gets redefined. Because the AES isn't just rejecting Western influence, it's building its own. And that shift, that fundamental reorganization of who holds leverage and why, is what's terrifying every strategist who thought Africa was a playground for great power competition. The Sahel isn't responding anymore. It's initiating. And that changes everything. And now all eyes turn to Cameroon, the next decisive battlefield, the next pressure point where global powers will test whether this wave can be stopped or whether it's already too late. Because Cameroon isn't just a transit state anymore. It's the hinge.